Welcome back to Mortgage Matters with Pinnacle Mortgage Planning.
All right, for everybody who wants to own a home, thinks they can't afford it, listen up. This could be for you. There's something called a lease option, and we could make that work for you today on Pinnacle Mortgage Planning. This is Mortgage Matters, brought to you by Pinnacle Mortgage Planning. Talking to Travis Newton, he's with Northwest Lease Purchase, and also Steve Valenta from Pinnacle Mortgage Planning. The lease option, Travis Newton, we were talking about how this might work for people who otherwise may not qualify for a loan. And who is the management company, for example? Who handles this transaction between the buyer and the seller? Would that be you at Northwest Lease Purchase?
We manage all the contracts of the property between the buyer and the seller. And depending on what the seller wants to do, if they want to have a professional management company manage the property, we have an affiliation with Key Property Services out of Vancouver that would handle that side of it for us. On the contractual side, we basically turn everything into the escrow company, and through a contract collections account that handles the mortgage for the seller, the taxes, the insurance, and the rent coming in, so that everything's documented. The buyer knows that the mortgage is being paid of the seller. The seller then is pretty much hands-off of paying the mortgage, taxes, and insurance, and everything just goes through the normal motions, and we wait out the term of the contract.
The way the lease option works, we were discussing earlier, the buyer pays a little extra money on top of the payment, and that money is applied towards the purchase price. So explain how that works. You called it a savings account. Could you expand on that a little bit? What exactly does that mean? Sure.
It's essentially a forced savings plan for the buyer. So the goal at the end of this term, when the buyer exercises their option to purchase, is to have enough money from their option fee that they pay up front and their rent premium, or rent credits, as some call it, to be able to have all the money in place for their down payment and closing costs to purchase the loan.
Steve Valenta explained earlier that this would work well, for example, if you have credit issues or other problems that may keep you out of that home that you really want. And here's a point to make, too, and I guess we can swing it back to Steve Valenta for this one. Steve, what kinds of homes or properties are available under a lease option? Is there a certain cap on the value of the home, or is the sky the limit?
There's no cap to the to the option. Really what it comes down to is the seller willing to sell the property this way? So Travis will find sellers that are comfortable with the process and will be willing to offer and extend additional terms. I think because it is a fairly difficult or more challenging time to sell a home today, this is one option that a seller has to extend terms to a buyer, and as using the term that Travis used earlier, increasing the buyer pool for additional buyers to purchase homes.
Now, does this apply to existing properties only? What about building a new home? Could I do a lease option for something like that?
In fact, we do work with a builder that is offering that, and I'll let Travis speak directly on that as well.
This is Travis Newton from Northwest Lease Purchase, and that kind of surprises me, Travis, the fact that you can build a new home using this process. How does that work?
It's an incredible opportunity. We're very excited about it. We represent Evergreen Homes Northwest out of Vancouver, and we have 5 subdivisions, 3 in Vancouver, 1 in Camas, 1 in Washougal. And as long as you build on our lot and have sufficient option money and get approved through Steve, then our builder is willing to build a custom home for you in one of our subdivisions.
So those subdivisions are located throughout Vancouver?
That's right, Vancouver, Camas, and Washougal.
So you would have your pick. If I were interested in this option, could you show me where those subdivisions are? I mean, who takes me around and shows me the property?
That would be me.
You're the man. So that's Travis Newton from Northwest Lease Purchase. Where exactly are the subdivisions now? Could you give me a breakdown of, let's say I want a nice suburban home in Vancouver. I have X amount of money. Let's say I have $500,000 that I'm able to finance. Where would you send me?
If you had $500,000 to finance, I'd probably send you to our Camas subdivision in Lacamas Point. It's just north of Round Lake.
Sure, I'm familiar with the area. Yeah, that's very nice.
Yeah.
What if my budget was a little bit less? And I don't want to knock on any neighborhood, but what if I just didn't have quite that much money to work with? Where else could I go?
Our subdivisions on the lower end would be, in the $175,000 range on up to probably the $500,000. So anywhere, if you qualify somewhere in between there, then we've got a subdivision for you that we can build a custom home for.
Let's talk about some other scenarios, too, and let's take it back to Steve maybe for this, and you can toss it back to Travis if you wish, Steve, but let's say I have a certain amount of money, and that amount of money is relatively low, but I know within a few years I'm going to be making more money. I realize you guys can't work on promises, but would the lease option be good in a scenario like that, where I know more income is going to be available within a few years?
It's a classic example. Often we'll have students that are just graduating, or maybe doctors that are just finishing up their residency, and they are certain that their incomes are going to be quite a bit higher.
Well, certainly that would be me right there. So once I get that brain surgery
that's right.
business underway.
So that's a classic example. The key to this working and having the highest success rate is the work up front that we do to make sure that we're not putting a buyer in a situation that won't work for them in the end, and then also giving the assurance to the seller so it increases their likelihood of actually closing the property. So what we don't want to do is put anybody into a situation that ends up going sour in the end. So we take them through the filters that we do to assure that they're actually able to perform in the end.
That being the case, there's a lot to be said for experience. You say certain scenarios that you learn to recognize. So I would think having gained a certain amount of experience in the Vancouver area, you can always apply that. And are market conditions different in different markets? For example, Steve, in Vancouver, would there be specific conditions that would apply to certain situations? I know, for example, my $500,000 or $100,000 would buy a bigger, better home than it might in the Portland market. Is that correct?
I think it's open to particular markets that are in need of more creative options to create more buyers. So as we have an already limited buyer pool, if we're able to create more buyers by allowing this option, then it brings more buyers to the market to help fulfill the amount of inventory that is for sale.
So the more people you have out there buying, the better the overall market is. Is that correct?
That's right.
So you want to generate as much business as possible, and the lease option is one way to do that.
Yeah, and I think looking in my world is in regard to lending goes, lending guidelines and lending standards are a whole lot different, a bit more conservative than they were, say, 5, 6, 8 years ago, when back in the day, you really just kind of needed a pulse to be able to qualify and were able to qualify for a home purchase. It's not that way anymore. It's much, much more conservative. And so this allows for those guidelines to be broadened a little bit more in terms of them being able to qualify, maybe not now, but just within the next 18 to 36 months.
And not to beat a dead horse, but it was those loose conditions that helped create the problems we've had in the past few years.
Absolutely. I think it would be ignorant to say that the guidelines were too loose, that they were too liberal, and we've all learned from that, and it's a pendulum that swings from back and forth, and we're at a point right now where it's very, very conservative. Probably could swing a little bit away from that, but at this point, it's probably an okay place to be.
Well, and I think it's kind of self-correcting too. And so, for those who may have qualified before but won't now, you have things like the lease option. That's specifically why these things exist.
What Travis is putting together is truly the market coming to surface, fixing our housing crisis, our housing problem, and it's a very progressive program, and it's working well.
Yeah, and I think too that speaks well to the market and to the people who run the market, such as yourselves. I mean, you found ways to get people into homes responsibly. Maybe let's go back to that for a moment, Travis. This again, Travis Newton from Northwest Lease Purchase today on Mortgage Matters, brought to you by Pinnacle Mortgage Planning. Travis Newton, tell us, is this a responsible way for buyers who otherwise might not be able to get into a home to make their purchase?
Absolutely. It's a great option for somebody to get out of the apartment, actually find a home that they would want to purchase, let Steve qualify them, and make sure that you can, get a loan in the next couple of years, and not have to have a landlord kick you out of a house because they're selling it. It's just an awesome opportunity for anybody that has a good job, has some money in the bank, and wants to create an opportunity for themselves and take advantage of the low housing prices that we have right now, because you are locked into today's prices.
And again, not to state the obvious again, but if you're paying rent right now, of course, you're kind of throwing that money away. For a little extra money, you could make that investment. Somebody may say, well, I don't have that extra money, but it's worth the investment, is it not? Because like you said, the money's going into what you called a temporary savings account, with that money being applied towards the purchase of the property.
Right. If you were renting, solely renting and trying to purchase a home, you'd need to throw a few $100s away a month in to a bank account anyways. So this is a forced savings plan to ensure you and the seller that you're going to have enough money to close when you exercise your option to purchase.
In our next segment, we'll talk more about the whole process, but let's get started on that a little bit now. Let's say I'm thinking of buying a property. Who do I see first? Do I see Steve first? Do I see Travis first? I just have a general idea. Let's say I have a wife, 2 kids. I want, 2 bedrooms minimum, and I have X amount of money. What would be a good amount of money? Let's say $200,000-$300,000. That's what I want to finance. Using those as my base, who do I go to with that information? Who's the first person I speak to?
You could really go to either one of us. I would qualify and be happy to talk to you about what it is that you're looking for, and then have you make application with Steve, and vice versa, I would presume.
And is that the typical way it's done? Do people come in with a list of conditions and circumstances, or do they usually have a specific property in mind?
Usually they're either calling on one of the properties that we're offering a lease option on, and if that property doesn't work for them, or if they can afford more or less, then we'll try to find out what it is they're looking for and take them down that road.
So with that in mind, we want to go through the whole process a little more thoroughly, but we're running out of time right now, so we'll do that our next segment. So we'll go through the whole thing, how you find a property, how you maybe find that you can't get that property, what the option B would be, and where information is available online or elsewhere. That's all next on Mortgage Matters here on Pinnacle Mortgage Planning. This is AM 1550 and 1550talk.com, Vancouver's talk station.